for centuries. So, the image of Jesus Christ has been one of the most powerful and recognizable symbols in human history. Yet, what if the image most of the world has grown up with is not the full story? What if, hidden away in museum vaults and monastery archives, there exists sacred artworks that challenge everything we think we know about biblical history and religious representation? Today's story begins far from the usual centers of Western religious art. In Russia, ancient Orthodox icons, some dating back hundreds of years, have drawn renewed attention for one striking reason. They depict Jesus, Mary, and other biblical figures with dark skin. These are not modern reinterpretations, not political statements, and not recent revisions. According to scholars of Orthodox tradition, these icons were preserved under strict artistic rules that discouraged alteration, copying each figure generation after generation with deep reverence and consistency. This raises an uncomfortable but fascinating question. If these icons were not altered to fit modern ideas, then what were their original artists trying to preserve? Were they reflecting theology, symbolism, or a historical memory that later traditions slowly replaced? And if such images existed openly in parts of the Christian world, why did a very different image come to dominate global consciousness? This is not a story about attacking faith. It is a story about uncovering layers of history about how power, culture, and tradition shape what we see, what we inherit, and what we accept as normal. It is about looking beyond familiar images and asking why some narratives were amplified, while others were quietly forgotten. Before we go deeper, take a moment to support this channel. If you value thoughtful storytelling, historical curiosity, reigniting, and perspectives that challenge conventional narratives, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. Your support helps keep these conversations alive. Now, let us step inside the vaults and into a story history never stopped telling. As we move deeper into this story, one detail becomes impossible to ignore. The Bible itself is remarkably silent about the physical appearance of Jesus. In a text that carefully records genealogies, journeys, parables, and moral teachings, there is no description of his skin tone, hair texture, eye color, or facial features. This absence is not accidental. It suggests that, for the earliest believers, what Jesus taught and represented mattered far more than how he looked. Yet over time, that silence created a space one that later cultures would fill with their own image. Jesus lived in 1st century Galilee, a region shaped by the crossroads of Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. It was not an isolated European landscape, but a sun-baked province of the Roman Empire populated by Semitic peoples whose appearance would have reflected the climate and ancestry of the Eastern Mediterranean. As a Jewish man born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, Jesus would have shared the physical traits common to that region. He would not have stood out from his disciples, a detail subtly confirmed by the gospel account of his arrest, when Judas had to identify him among the group. If Jesus had looked dramatically different from those around him, such identification would have been unnecessary. This quiet biblical detail stands in sharp contrast to the dominant image that later emerged across Europe. Centuries after Jesus' life, artists began to depict him through the lens of their own societies, gradually shaping a version of Christ that mirrored the rulers, cultures, and ideals of their time. These images were not created to deceive, but they reflected the world in which they were produced over generations. Depictions as repetition turned familiarity into perceived truth, until the European portrayal of Jesus felt timeless and unquestionable. This is where the Russian icons re-enter the story with such force. Unlike much of Western religious art, Orthodox iconography followed rigid traditions designed to preserve continuity rather than encourage innovation. Icons were not meant to be imaginative portraits. but visual theology, passed down with disciplined consistency. When such icons depict biblical figures with darker skin tones, they disrupt assumptions not through argument, but through presence. They do not explain themselves. They simply exist, quietly asking why history remembers one image so vividly and forgets others so completely. The absence of a physical description in Scripture, combined with the geographic reality of Jesus' life, does not offer a single definitive portrait. Instead, it exposes how deeply interpretation shapes belief. When one image becomes dominant, it can feel inseparable from faith itself, even when it rests on cultural tradition rather than textual evidence. The rediscovery and re-examination of alternative depictions do not remove meaning from the story of Jesus. They expand it, reminding us that faith once lived in many faces before it was narrowed into one. In this sense, the question is not what Jesus looked like, but why that question became so important later in history. The Russian icons, the biblical silence, and the historical setting of Galilee converge into a single realization. What we see in sacred images often reveals more about ourselves than about the past. And when those images are revisited, they invite us to reconsider not only history, but the invisible choices that shaped how it was told. Once these icons are brought into view, their impact goes far beyond art history. They quietly but powerfully unsettle an image that has been normalized for centuries. The Western portrayal of Jesus as unmistakably white and European. This image, so deeply embedded in churches, paintings, books, and popular culture, often feels timeless, as if it has always existed in this form. Yet the moment alternative depictions surface, especially ones preserved within an ancient Christian tradition, the sense of certainty begins to fracture. What makes the Russian icons so disruptive is not that they argue, but that they endure. They stand as visual evidence that Christianity never spoke with a single face. Long before global empires carried European art across continents, faith was already being expressed through different cultural lenses. These icons did not emerge from modern social movements or contemporary debates. They survived wars, revolutions, and deliberate destruction. Their survival alone raises an unsettling question. If these images were once acceptable, even sacred, why do they feel so controversial now? As these works re-enter public awareness, they reignite conversations that many societies had long avoided. The discussion is no longer only about theology or aesthetics, but about how power shapes memory. When European nations expanded across the world, they did not carry only armies and trade routes. They carried symbols. Over time, the European image of Jesus became intertwined with authority, morality, and legitimacy. It appeared on flags, in colonial churches, and in the institutions that governed everyday life. Gradually, this image stopped being recognized as a cultural interpretation and instead became treated as historical fact. The Russian icons disrupt that illusion by revealing how selective historical memory can be. Their darker figures force viewers to confront a simple but uncomfortable truth. The dominance of one image required the marginalization of others. This does not mean that Western art was deliberately false, but it does mean that it was never neutral. Every brushstroke carried the assumptions of its time, just as every preserved icon carries the worldview of its creators. As these images resurface, debates naturally follow. Some see them as symbolic, others as historically suggestive, and still others as challenges to deeply held beliefs. Faith, for many, has been emotionally tied to a familiar image of Christ, one that feels personal and comforting. When that image is questioned, it can feel like an attack, even when the challenge comes from within the same religious tradition. Yet history has always been layered, rarely offering comfort before clarity. What is emerging now is not a single replacement image, but a broader understanding. Scholars, religious leaders, Sophia, And ordinary viewers are beginning to acknowledge that Jesus has been imagined differently across cultures precisely because the earliest sources left room for interpretation. The renewed debate is not about choosing one image and destroying another, but about recognizing how race, geography, and political power influenced which representations survived and which faded into obscurity. In this light, the unveiling of these icons becomes less about rewriting belief and more about restoring complexity. They invite a more honest conversation about how faith travels through history, adapting to the faces of those who carry it. And in doing so, they challenge the idea that truth must look only one way, reminding us that the past is often far richer and far more uncomfortable than the version we inherited. To understand why these icons carry such weight today, we must follow their journey through one of the most hostile periods in religious history. During the Soviet era, faith was not merely discouraged, it was treated as an obstacle to progress. Churches were closed, monasteries dismantled, and countless sacred objects were destroyed, sold, or left to decay. In this environment, survival itself became a form of testimony. The icons that remain are not simply old paintings. They are witnesses to an age that tried, and failed, to erase them. What makes their survival even more remarkable is the tradition that governed their creation. Russian Orthodox iconography was inherited directly from the Byzantine world, where icons were not considered personal expressions of the artist but sacred transmissions. Each image followed carefully preserved models, repeated across generations with disciplined precision. The goal was not innovation, realism, or emotional drama, but continuity. An icon was meant to reflect eternal truth, not contemporary fashion. For that reason, altering an icon to suit new cultural preferences was not only discouraged, but seen as a violation of its spiritual purpose. This rigid structure explains why claims of later modification face serious challenges. Unlike Western religious art, which evolved rapidly in response to political power and artistic movements, Orthodox icons resisted change. Colors, postures, facial proportions, depictions, and symbolic elements were passed down through strict visual language. When darker skin tones appear consistently across icons from different regions and centuries, they cannot easily be dismissed as accidents or later additions. They reflect what earlier icon painters believed they were faithfully preserving. The Soviet campaign against religion unintentionally strengthened the credibility of these works. Many icons were hidden by believers, sealed behind walls, buried in private homes, or smuggled out of the country to avoid destruction. Others survived because museum curators, despite official ideology, recognized their historical value and quietly safeguarded them. These icons were frozen in time, untouched by modern reinterpretation, political pressure, or cultural revision. When they re-emerged decades later, they appeared exactly as they had been before the suppression began. This historical interruption matters deeply to the broader story. While much of the world was reshaping religious imagery to align with empire, colonialism, and modern identity, these icons remained outside that process. They were not adjusted to match Western expectations or global trends. Their preservation under extreme conditions lends them a kind of unintended neutrality. They were not preserved to make a statement. They were preserved because someone believed they mattered. When placed alongside the earlier discussion about the Bible's silence on physical appearance and the later dominance of European imagery, the role of Byzantine rules becomes clearer. These icons function like visual fossils, capturing a moment before one image became dominant worldwide. They remind us that what survived in public view was not always what existed everywhere. Much was lost, hidden, or deliberately erased, while a few fragments endured in silence. The rediscovery of these icons does not prove a single historical conclusion. but it challenges the assumption that religious imagery naturally evolved toward a European ideal. Instead, it reveals how survival, power, and tradition shape what history remembers. The icons that endured Soviet destruction now speak into a modern world still struggling with questions of representation and truth. Their presence forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that what we consider original may simply be what was allowed to remain visible. In this way, the strict discipline of Byzantine iconography and the brutal interruption of the Soviet era combine into a single, powerful legacy. They preserved images that history tried to silence, and in doing so, they now compel us to look again, not only at the icons themselves, but at the long journey that determined which faces of faith we were taught to see. As the conversation deepens, attention inevitably turns to one of the most contested questions surrounding these icons, whether the dark skin tones are deliberate or merely the effect of time. For generations, viewers were taught to believe that age alone darkens paint, that centuries of candle smoke, varnish, and exposure gradually transform once light faces into shadowed ones. At first glance, this explanation feels reassuring because it allows familiar assumptions to remain intact. Yet when these icons are examined closely, that explanation begins to unravel. In many of the preserved works, the dark tones appear selectively and consistently. Faces and hands are rendered with depth and intention, while garments, gold backgrounds, and surrounding elements retain their original vibrancy. If time alone were responsible, the entire surface would darken uniformly. Instead, what emerges is a pattern of contrast that suggests purpose rather than decay. Icon painters worked with symbolic color language, where every shade carried meaning, and nothing was applied casually. Within such a disciplined tradition, accidental distortion would not repeat itself across centuries and regions. This realization pushes the story beyond art conservation and into historical memory. If these tones were intentional, then they reflect how earlier communities imagined sacred figures before later cultural dominance reshaped those images. This does not claim photographic realism, but it does claim historical presence. The icons suggest that darker-skinned people were not foreign to the biblical imagination of the ancient world, but woven into it. In regions shaped by trade routes connecting Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean, this should not be surprising. Antiquity was far more interconnected than modern narratives often allow. From here, the story naturally expands toward broader claims about Black presence in ancient history. Long before modern racial categories existed, populations moved, intermarried, ruled, and worshipped across vast territories. Ancient kingdoms rose along the Nile, across the Levant, and throughout North Africa, leaving cultural and spiritual imprints that later civilizations inherited. When sacred art emerged from these interconnected worlds, it carried echoes of that diversity, even if later generations chose to forget it. What makes this argument so powerful is not certainty, but accumulation. The silence of Scripture about physical appearance, the geographic reality of the biblical world, the survival of icons under strict rules, and now the intentional use of darker tones all point in the same direction. Together, they challenge the idea that one image of antiquity naturally replaced all others. Instead, they suggest that history was filtered, refined, and narrowed as it passed through empires that benefited from seeing themselves reflected in the divine. For some viewers, these claims feel destabilizing because they touch something deeper than art or history. They question inherited images that shaped identity, faith, and belonging. Yet the presence of darker-skinned figures in sacred art does not diminish anyone's connection to belief. It widens it. It reminds us that the ancient world was not built in isolation, and that spiritual traditions emerged from shared human spaces rather than sealed cultural boxes. The icons do not shout these ideas. They do not declare conclusions. They simply remain, carrying visual memory across centuries of silence. In doing so, they ask a quiet but persistent question. If these images existed long before modern debates, why does their presence feel so disruptive now? Perhaps the discomfort does not come from the past itself, but from how selectively the past has been remembered. As this chapter of the story unfolds, the icons become more than preserved wood and pigment. They become mirrors reflecting forgotten connections, reminding us that ancient history was shaped by many faces, many journeys, and many voices. And when those voices re-emerge, they do not demand agreement. They demand attention. As this story reaches its conclusion, the rediscovery of these icons no longer feels confined to the past. Instead, it flows directly into the present, where societies across the world are re-examining the images, symbols, and narratives they inherited. The debate surrounding religious imagery today is not happening in isolation. It is part of a broader reckoning with how history has been framed, who controlled that framing, and whose perspectives were elevated or silenced along the way. For centuries, religious art did more than express faith. It reinforced authority. When empires rose, their image of the sacred often rose with them, spreading through churches, schools, books, and public spaces. Over time, representation became normalized, and normalization slowly transformed into perceived truth. What began as cultural interpretation hardened into tradition. Even when scripture itself remained silent, the modern conversation is now peeling back those layers, not to erase belief, but to understand how belief was visually shaped by power, politics, and cultural dominance. The resurfacing of these Russian icons enters that conversation as an unexpected witness. They remind us that alternative representations were never entirely absent. They were simply pushed to the margins of collective memory. Their survival challenges the idea that religious imagery evolved naturally toward a single form. Instead, it suggests that certain images prevailed because they aligned with those who held influence, resources, and global reach. This realization does not weaken faith. It strengthens historical honesty. Today's movements calling for a re-evaluation of religious imagery are often misunderstood as acts of division. In reality, many of them are driven by a desire for completeness. They ask whether sacred symbols can truly speak to humanity if they only reflect the faces of the powerful. They question whether faith loses meaning when it is stripped of its historical and cultural diversity. And they invite believers and non-believers alike to separate scripture from tradition, devotion from dominance. The story of these icons does not offer a final answer to what sacred figures should look like. Instead, it offers something far more valuable: perspective. It shows that faith has always crossed borders, long before modern categories of race and identity existed. It reveals that history is rarely a single line, but a web of overlapping truths, shaped as much by preservation and loss as by belief itself. In the end, these images ask us to look again, not only at the icons, but at ourselves. They challenge us to consider how easily familiarity becomes authority, and how often inherited images go unquestioned simply because they are old. They remind us that truth is not always loud, but it endures, waiting patiently to be seen again. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you found this journey thought-provoking and believe these conversations matter, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps keep space open for deeper discussions, honest history, and stories that invite us to see the past and the present with clearer eyes.